Okay, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to do some philosophy of mind, and we'll take a look at our first big main theory about the mind and what it is. The idea of substance dualism, which you're already a little bit familiar with from Descartes, and it's also something that you find in various forms in religious traditions. Right? The idea that there are two basic types of things: there's physical stuff and non-physical stuff. Maybe you call it spiritual stuff, something like that. So we saw this in Descartes, and we'll just sort of do a little review of that. It is not really a popular view in philosophy at all anymore, and we'll see why. There are still plenty of people who are substance dualists, and it may be correct after all. I just wanted to flag that in the contemporary debate in philosophy of mind, substance dualism is not really a popular contender. Okay, but still, historically, we should look at it and we should take it seriously. And like I said, it is a popular view outside of the philosophical community, right? So here we've got a little picture that I picked. It's a Vermeer painting, and kind of can make you think about this whole thing about the mind, right? Because you see something very visual. You see an object that in real life they would be reflecting all these light waves, right? A Newtonian physical object, an extended being, this person over here. But we can also tell, just as being a human being with empathy and understanding that other people have minds as well, we can understand that this is a person reading a letter, perhaps feeling big emotions, thinking about things, feeling, and so on. There's this whole other hidden aspect, right? So there's the purely physical that we can see and measure, but then there's also something going on inside of her mind, and we just don't know what it is. Right? Even if we opened up her her skull and looked at her brain, we just see a bunch of synapses firing, right? But she's going through something. There's something that it is like to be this person, right? She's got a subjective state of mind, all this stuff. So that makes us think about, well, there do seem to be these sort of two different realms, right? The realm of physical objects around us, and then the realm of the mind. The substance dualist takes that intuition very seriously and says, yeah, that's what the world is like. There are two basic types of things, right? There's matter stuff and mind stuff. And that's what Descartes came up with, right? Two basic kinds of things: extended things, and here extended again just means something like three-dimensional, right? Occupying space. And then minds is the other thing, right? Extended things are defined by their extension in space, right? Their three-dimensionality, the fact that they're occupying some part of space. And minds are defined by their capacities, right? Their capacity for thought and experience. Notice Descartes doesn't ever really say what minds really are, the way that we can say about extended things that they are made of atoms or something like that. We don't really get a story from Descartes about what minds are made of, but he does seem to think that they're a kind of thing or a kind of substance. So he just takes the route of, well, the mind is whatever it is that can think and experience and feel. And minds, by definition, are not extended in space. They're not three-dimensional. They don't take up any space at all. So we divide all of reality into these two basic categories, right? That's what dualism means. Dualism is twoism. Substance is things that exist. Right? So there are basically two kinds of things that exist in the world. There's the extended things. Those are defined by all these these things that are very quantitative, that science can study: size, shape, location, whether it's moving, how fast, whether it's at rest, what its mass is, the solidity, all these very physical variables here that science is all about, that science can study. And this is the world of Newtonian physics right here. Whereas minds, on the other hand, they're defined by these sorts of things: thought and sensation, memory, belief, desire, imagination, all the things that minds can do. And for Descartes and any substance dualist, these two things are, they're very, very separate. Their minds can exist on their own on this view. They're not dependent on extended things. And remember that part of Descartes' project was dividing up the world into the world that science can study, the world of matter and motion, and then there's the world of religion or theology, and that occupies itself with things like souls and what happens to souls after the body dies and things like that. That's all on this other side over here. Okay. So what is Descartes' argument for this? Well, the main argument here is that what we call the principle of indiscernibility of identicals. It's a mouthful, but it basically just means that if X and Y are the same thing, then they must have all the same properties. Let me back up for a second. So that does make some intuitive sense, right? If something is the same as something else, it has to have all the same properties. So, for example, water is H2O. Well, anything that we can say about water, we can say about H2O. So the idea might go. I'm not sure if that's entirely true, but something like that is in the back of this supposed principle. Notice that I don't know how firm of a principle this is. Descartes really held on to this, but it's difficult to spell it out. There are certain problems with it, as we'll see in a minute. But for now, just go along with this sort of intuitive idea. If you're going to say that something is the same as something else, then it should have the same properties, right? If it's what you call numerically identical, right? Versus quantitatively identical. What that means is, look, I've got a black shirt. You might have the same shirt as me, right? Made by the same company with the same size and same color. Like, oh, look, same shirt. Well, we don't. That's qualitative identity. We don't mean that. Here we mean quantitative identity, numerical identity. So basically, if I just say that's the same as my shirt, in that sense, it would mean that it's actually this shirt right here. Right, so this shirt is identical with itself, of course, and it cannot have properties that it doesn't have, right? So if you go along with this principle, then you can say premise number one, if mind stuff is the same as matter stuff, all their properties would be the same. That's if you believe in the principle of indiscernibility of identicals. Then add a second premise. The properties of mind stuff and matter stuff are not the same. Well, if you are a logical type of person, or if you've been taking a critical thinking class, then you could see that these premises together logically entail a conclusion. Right? It would have to mean, right, if both of these premises are true, it would have to mean that mind stuff and matter stuff are not the same, right? Because they have different properties. Why should we think that they have different properties? What's the support for number two? Well, let's think about it, right? For one, remember Descartes' exercise in doubt? Matter stuff can be doubted. You can doubt the existence of your own body, even on Descartes' view. Right? You can doubt the existence of your brain. Right? It's possible, the argument would go, that you don't actually have a body, or you don't have the body that you think you do. It's possible. But mind stuff cannot be doubted. There can be no doubt that you have a mind, or else you wouldn't be there doing the doubting. Right? So that already, for Descartes, would mean, well, they have different properties. Matter stuff is dubitable. Mind stuff is not dubitable. So that means the properties of mind stuff and matter stuff are not the same. And if for two things to be the same thing, they would have to share all the same properties. Well, if they don't have the same properties, then that means they're not the same. Here's another one to support premise number two. Matter can be divided. You can divide matter up into smaller pieces. We can imagine what that would be like, right? You can take just about any object and imagine tearing it apart or breaking off a piece of it. And that's because it's extended in space. That's part of what we mean by being extended and having 3 dimensions, is you can zoom in on small parts, break it apart, do things like that. But how would you even begin to think about doing that with your mind? It's just not possible. Right? Because one of the properties of matter is that it can be divided, maybe even compounded, right? You can put it together with other matter. You can't do that really literally with the mind. So for Descartes, that means they have different properties. Mind stuff and matter stuff have to be different. There have to be two fundamental types of things. They can't be the same. You can ask, well, how much does a memory weigh? Right? That doesn't really seem to make a whole lot of sense, does it? Right? But you can ask that about physical objects. What about location? Right? Where's your desire to go to Disneyland located? Is there a particular location? It's hard to think about what that would be like. Is your belief in Santa moving or at rest? See, memories, desires, beliefs, these are all properties of the mind, and these rhetorical questions are trying to elicit your intuitions that those properties are not physical because they don't weigh anything, they're not located anything, they're not in motion or at rest. Well, they don't have a size, right? What is the size of your thought that it's sunny right now? Again, we mean like a literal size. It seems impossible to answer that. So that all these seem to show that mind stuff and matter stuff cannot be the same. They have different properties. Yeah. Well, if we were in class together, we'd spend some time analyzing this argument, and I'd ask you a little bit about it. For now, I would just want to point out this principle here is pretty tricky. I can give you a simple counter example where you see that it doesn't quite work. I think we talked about this in class as well. But for example, this idea of being able to be doubted, right? There's a famous identity. Superman is Clark Kent. Right? It's a true identity statement. And yet someone could doubt the existence of Superman, within that world. Let's say, right? Let's suppose Superman world is real. Well, you might have a person that knows Clark Kent and believes Clark Kent is real, but has never seen Superman and just doesn't believe in all the stories that people are telling about him. So in that case, the existence of Superman could be doubted. The existence of Clark Kent is not doubted. Well, do we then say they have different properties, therefore they're not the same? Not quite, right? Because that property of being doubted is not really in the subject itself. That's something that we're bringing to the table. Someone else might not have that doubt. That doesn't really tell us anything about Clark Kent or Superman. It tells us something about the person that's thinking about it. In the same way, we might say the fact that you can't doubt or you don't doubt mind stuff, but you can doubt matter stuff, maybe that doesn't tell us anything about mind stuff and matter stuff. Maybe it only tells us something about the person thinking about it. So it's not entirely clear that the argument is good there. And there's also the problem of different levels, right? We did the hierarchy of being in class earlier, where you can tell, look, molecules, for example, living molecules, we say all sorts of things about them. Molecules. Let's talk about cells instead, right? One level up. We can talk about cells as these living organisms. We can talk about how they reproduce and how they ingest food and use energy. We can say all this stuff about living cells. But we know that living cells are just made out of dead molecules, and molecules are just made out of atoms. Now, those cells are nothing but atoms. They're not made of anything different. Cells just are a collection of atoms. And yet we say different things about cells than we talk about atoms. Right? So the same thing might be going on here. It may just be that the mind is an emergent property, and our talk of the mind is at this higher level than our talk about atoms or things in motion, things at rest, and how much things weigh. Right? If the mind or consciousness is an emergent property, then it makes sense that we say different things about that than we do about the substrate that is realizing, causing and realizing these conscious states. So all I'm saying here is here's an argument, but there are reasons to doubt the argument. There are problems with the argument. Okay. There are also problems with dualism itself, even if we sort of say, well, I'm not sure the argument's good, but what about the position if we take it seriously? The main problem here is the problem of mind-body interaction. And this is one of the main reasons that people have, philosophers at least, contemporary philosophers have sort of given up on this old-fashioned kind of mind-body dualism. Right? Because how could how could this fundamentally immaterial stuff somehow cause material stuff to do things? There's a huge problem there. Again, we tend to think a decision, for example, is a mental event, right? I can decide to raise my hand. That's my mind. My mind says, okay, I'm going to raise my hand, and up she goes. Right? Up goes my hand. Very everyday phenomena, right? You say this all the time, that you cause your own behavior. Well, maybe you don't say that, but it's true, right? You do things, you decide to do things. Now, if that decision is being produced in some sort of immaterial realm, completely separate from the physical world, well, how in the world would that happen? We just have no answer. Right? So this theory just brings along with it this huge mystery. A theory is supposed to elucidate, it's supposed to explain. It's not supposed to throw us further into confusion and darkness. So there's a real problem here with the mind-body interaction. How does that work? And there's different ways to look at that. Oh yeah, I wanted to say this really quick. Even Descartes seems to be kind of inconsistent, right? He defines the mind or the soul as something completely immaterial, as existing outside of the physical realm that science studies. But then he does say things like, I feel like I'm lodged in my body, like a pilot in a vessel. And I'm very closely united to it, and so to speak, intermingled with it. Right? Intermingling is something physical. So Descartes here can't help but express his thoughts about the mind in somewhat physical terms. He seems to be thinking of it as something that's extended throughout the body. Of course, it can't be on his own definition. Right? And here again, down here, the union and an apparent intermingling of mind and body. He's saying apparent. He's trying to be careful, but he does really seem to be saying that the mind and the body intermingle. And that does seem to be a bit closer to how we experience ourselves. It is true that it's hard to talk about where a pain exactly is located, but at the same time, it's located somewhere over here-ish, or my thought about Disneyland. It's maybe hard to point where in my head it's happening, but if I'm thinking about Disneyland, it's happening over here, not in the other room. So this makes a bit more sense. We do seem to experience our consciousness as sort of intermingled with our body. But I'm just pointing out that Descartes seems to be anyway, completely contradicting himself, what he says in other places. Because in other places he says very clearly, the mind is outside of the physical realm altogether. Here he's saying the mind is somehow intermingled with the body. So here's another problem it's related to all this, the mind-body interaction problem. Right? Descartes, like Newton, agreed that all the physical stuff in the world follows these universal laws, and the behavior of matter can always be explained in terms of other matter. Right? It's basically a bunch of little bits of matter bumping into each other and being dispersed, and we can talk about how that happens with these scientific laws, and we can quantify it all, and we can quite understand that every physical event has some sort of physical material explanation. However, go back to a human being making a decision, right? If I decide to raise my hand, does that have a Newtonian explanation? The movement of my hand? Can that be explained in terms of physics? Well, it should be. If my hand is a physical object in the physical world, then both Descartes and Newton should be able to treat that as just another physical object that has whose behavior and movements have physical explanations. But we also want to say that it's my decision to raise my hand that caused it to raise. Now, if a decision is a non-physical thing, then it would mean that the physical behavior of this object in space cannot be entirely explained by other physical things happening. So that's a huge problem, because that contradicts the whole idea that the extended world is one that we can understand scientifically in terms of physical causes. So there's another problem right there, right? Just the problem of the movements of human bodies. Are human bodies Newtonian objects that obey the laws of physics? Or are we somehow, every time we make a decision, every time we choose to do something, it's a supernatural event, basically? And that's what would have to be the case. If my decision to raise my hand, if that decision was not a physical event, if it's some sort of non-physical event outside the realm of nature, then it would be a supernatural event. It would be a miracle, right? It would be the case that we cannot explain the movement of my hand just by talking about physics and the laws of physics or even biology. No, it would have to be caused by something outside of that realm altogether. And that seems strange, right? It seems very strange to think that every human decision is literally a miracle, a supernatural event. If you just want to just zero in on this as well, right? So somehow the mind causes matter to move, such as when I make a decision to raise my hand. Well, in Descartes' view, how is that possible? Where is it somehow moving the atoms that compose my hand? Where is it doing that? There has to be some location, but at the same time, there can't be a location because the mind can't be located anywhere. So it's just a huge conundrum. How do we think about that? It just doesn't seem to make any sense. Descartes himself suggested that the pineal gland in the brain is somehow the interface between the soul or the mind and the body, right? And so that the brain is, I don't know what role it would have to play, but somehow taking in all the sensory data and distilling it down, and then it goes all the way here to the pineal gland, and then it sort of gets shipped off to the mind. But where? How? Where's the mind? Well, the mind isn't anywhere, right, on this view. So somehow the brain produces all the images and visuals and auditory phenomena, tactile phenomena, all that, and somehow delivers it to the mind, but it doesn't really help explain where that's happening and how it's happening just by assuming or just by postulating that maybe it's the pineal gland. Where on the pineal gland? Where is it going? How is it doing this? We have no sort of answer to those questions at all on this view. Oops. So mind-body interaction, each of these three questions here are pointing to the same thing. There's this huge problem about, well, once you make the mind this completely separate kind of thing, how can you explain the way that it apparently interacts with the physical world? Because again, right, it's supposed to just be a basic idea that our minds, cause matter to move every time we make a decision. Every time you decide to go for a walk or decide to get a drink from the fridge, right? Your decision, a mental event, is causing a physical event. If Descartes is right and the mental event is completely separate from the physical world, that's just a fundamental mystery then. How is that supposed to work? We don't really get an answer. After Descartes, people liked his dualism, but people started bringing up these problems. There were a couple of ways in which people try to solve the problem, and very true to the time, right? Just invoke God, of course. Any problem you can have God solve. So occasionalism is the view that there's not really any interaction between our mind and what's happening physically at all. So when I decide to raise my hand, for example, there's nothing that's from the decision actually causing my hand to rise. It's rather I make the decision, and then God recognizes that I made that decision, and then makes sure that I have this experience of my hand rising, my hand going up, right? So that it's sort of all, God is constantly just making sure that whenever we have a mental event that we think is linked to a physical event, then God makes that physical event happen. Right? So, yeah, I mean, it's a way of getting out of the problem, I suppose. One problem is, of course, is that not everyone believes in God, right? Theism is kind of an assumption in this case. You have to already believe in God in order for that solution to be viable. It's also a little bit problematic once you start having to patch up a theory. Right? So this is sometimes called post hoc rationalization, where you hadn't really thought your idea through, but you like your idea, so you just try to sort of scramble for anything that could explain the problem away. So yeah, you could do it this way, of course, if you have within your inventory of ways to deal with problems, you have this omnipotent being who can literally do anything, then yeah, of course, God could make sure that every time I decide to raise my hand, that God then causes me to raise my hand. And on the other hand, that only works because we're just sort of postulating that God is all powerful, but we still kind of have that problem left over of, well, how is God as a non-physical mind interacting with the physical world? We still don't really get an answer to the question. Another way to do it is, well, this would be silly if God was constantly having to intervene in our life, just constantly for every decision you make. God has to make your body do something. That'd be kind of strange. So maybe God just set up the universe from the very beginning in such a way that our mental experiences always line up with what's happening physically. That's another way of trying to get out of it. It's basically the same as this view, but it's just God is a little less busy on that view. Okay. Okay, I think that's it for substance dualism. If we were in class, we'd talk a lot more about this, and I'd get your feedback and your ideas, and we dwell on certain problems. I'd be able to clarify things if I could. For now, yeah, I mean, this is good background to have. Again, like I said, substance dualism is not taken that seriously in contemporary philosophy. Well, I should rephrase that. It's taken seriously. It's not mocked or anything like that. It's just that there are huge problems with it. The argument for it is flawed, and the position itself has some major problems. One of the main problems here is that why should it be that the mind is off limits to science? That's a big question, right? Is that really true? That we can't study mental processes scientifically? Well, anyone familiar even a little bit with brain science will understand just how much knowledge we've gathered about mental processes just by studying the brain. Right? So to say that the mind is just completely separate from the physical realm, that just seems to be empirically wrong. Right? It certainly seems that way, that we understand so many aspects of the mind better now that we have studied the brain. So that's a main reason for rejecting dualism, is because it means the conversation is over in terms of science. Right? Science just cannot deal with the mind if this is true. If the mind is just this sort of spiritual essence completely separate from the physical world, there's just nothing for science to do. Well, that doesn't seem like a fruitful position to take, right? And indeed, it's not the route that people have taken, right? In cognitive science and brain science in general. Right? The assumption has been that, no, minds are part of the physical world, right? Our consciousness, our ability to do various mental things, right? These are things that the human organism can do, and science can study how it does that. If substance dualism was true, it'd be difficult to see how there's any room at all for any science of the mind. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no problems left over. It doesn't necessarily mean that the mind just is the brain. Maybe there are some things to figure out, but for the most part, for most philosophers in the contemporary world, substance dualism is kind of antiquated and makes the mind too mysterious, too far out there, right? So the idea has been, what if we can study the mind scientifically? How do we do that? How do we use empirical methods to try to figure out what the mind is like and how it works? And so that's what we're going to look at next time. We're going to look at behaviorism, which was an early attempt in psychology to make psychology, science of the mind, more scientific by using more rigorous empirical methods. There were problems with it, but there's always problems with scientific theories, right? But they develop over time, they get better. And so that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at substance dualism. Sorry, we just looked at substance dualism. We're going to look at behaviorism. Then we will look at mind-brain identity theory. And then very closely related to it, functionalism. Mind-brain identity and functionalism both agree that it's the brain that is responsible for all our conscious experience. They both agree that substance dualism is wrong. They just have slightly different ways of spelling out how we should state what the relationship is between the mind and the brain. Okay. Let's see, was there anything else I wanted to say about this? There probably is. It's difficult to think of this without you right in front of me. So just to recap, substance dualism, very popular view, argued for by Descartes, not easy to refute, right? It's not easy to say exactly why it's wrong. It's pretty easy to point at some problems. The main problem being mind-brain interaction, mind-body interaction, but also just the problem of the fact that if substance dualism is right, there can be no science of the mind. We do have a science of the mind, so it seems to follow that substance dualism must be wrong, or we wouldn't have had any success in trying to understand the mind, right? So substance dualism is largely an antiquated, an old-fashioned notion within circles in philosophy and in psychology as well, though it is still quite popular in religious contexts, because that's what you're basically saying when you say that you can continue to exist after your body dies. You'll continue to exist as this sort of spiritual essence, and you'll continue to have experiences, but not necessarily in the body. Maybe you'll get a new body later. Right? All these views, these traditional religious views, do seem to hold to some sort of substance dualism, right? Okay, so that tension that Descartes wanted to get rid of between the church and science, he did not quite get rid of that, because if Descartes had been successful, he would have shown once and for all that minds are off the table for scientific inquiry, that minds are these spiritual things that we can't say anything about scientifically. That's not what happened, right? We don't think that that's the case. Okay, well, I guess I should just end it at some point. I could keep going and going, but be on the lookout for the next video, which will be on behaviorism. All right, everybody, have a nice rest of your day. Have a nice weekend, and I'll see you here soon. Bye.